Welcome back to another volume of truly disturbing tales from Reddit. Today we're going to be narrating 3 new unsettling stories taken directly from the platform. I encourage you all to sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy these terrifying personal accounts. Now, without any further delay, let's jump right in. I'm a guy, mid-20s, living in the US. This happened a few months back, and I'd like to share it now. About a year ago, I decided to quit my corporate job of several years. Long story short, I was absolutely miserable, and I needed a serious change in my life. So I dipped into my savings, packed up only my most necessary belongings, and moved from my hometown on the East Coast to another city some 2,000 miles away. An impulsive decision for sure, but one that I don't regret. My first month, I sputtered through a series of odd jobs, casually drifting from one gig to another as I tried to figure out what I really wanted out of life. Eventually, an acquaintance suggested that I try bartending. At the time, I had no experience at all, but I thought, F it, why not put myself out there? Couldn't hurt to try. I applied to all the LGBT bars in town. Surprise, I'm gay as well. I figured that a job at one of these places would be a good way to integrate myself into the community, maybe even meet some guys, without having to resort to Grindr and the like. I quickly hit it off with the owner of a neighborhood pub, and he hired me on the spot, promising to mentor me in all things booze related. The following months were some of the best of my life. Met a lot of good people and gained a lot of perspective. I'm now starting grad school, but I still work at the same bar a couple of nights a week. That's actually where the following incident occurred. I should mention that this bar is on the corner of a main road and a quiet side street. That's important. Anyway, around 5:45 p.m., I parked my car halfway down the side street, which at that time was lined with cars, and I walked back to the pub. After taking some deep breaths and doing some quick mental prep, despite the nature of my job, I'm painfully introverted. I walk through the front door, toss my car keys into my knapsack, and toss my knapsack over the main bar. It's my routine. It's what I always do. Only bartenders are ever allowed behind the bar, and I've never really felt the need to lock my personal belongings in the back office. It's just not that kind of place. Almost all of the patrons are quality people, hard workers, community members, younger, older, everything in between. People who generally deserve a break every now and then, if only in the form of a cocktail, or 3. That being said, it's not cheers. Admittedly, this job has really made me wise to what so many women must have to endure on a regular basis. Not everyone is respectful of personal boundaries, especially when you're new. Fresh meat. I've been leered at. I fucked. I've had guys reach out and run their hands through my hair, stroke my chest, squeeze things, forcefully pull me closer, and whisper to me all the things they'd like to do, only to get righteous and angry when I don't enthusiastically reciprocate. My first week, my boss told me half-jokingly that this is a gay bar. There's no such thing as sexual harassment. I guess because they're dudes and I'm a dude. We're all dudes. I'm supposed to man up and just deal with it, which, for the most part, I do and did. The money's consistently good, but I still can't say that I'm entirely comfortable with it. Double standards absolutely suck. Anyway, Monday evenings can be hit or miss. That one Monday was a miss. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, only a couple of folks remained. That's when Vern walked in. I'd guess that Vern was in his mid to late 30s. Solid build, clean shaven, average looking, sort of impeccably anonymous. I'd never seen him before. He sat down at the edge of the counter, on the very last stool, next to where I enter and exit from behind the bar, and where I usually leave my belongings. He ordered a soda and introduced himself, and we made small talk for a few minutes. He seemed to be a pretty affable guy, and nothing about him seemed explicitly out of the ordinary. But admittedly, something about him didn't quite sit right with me. He almost seemed a little too ordinary, almost conspicuously so. He was dressed up as dressed down, if that makes any sense. It's hard to describe. Think along the lines of someone who might spend an hour trying to style perfect bedhead. Anyway, at some point, the topic got around to video games, which I absolutely love. And for a good 10 minutes, we discussed some upcoming releases we were both apparently excited about. Eventually, I had to excuse myself to help other customers, as well as finish a couple of other tasks that still needed doing. But Vern said it was no big deal, and of course, I needed to do my job. Cool, no problem. As I walked around the pub, cleaning this and that, I couldn't help but notice that whenever I happened to look in Vern's direction, he was already looking at me. This is something I've gotten used to as a bartender. But again, something in particular just didn't feel right. Sometimes he would look away, but most of the time he wouldn't, giving me a tiny, impenetrable smile. This went on for a while, nearly 2 hours I'd say. I'd walk up to him occasionally, ask him if he needed anything, and we'd have a brief exchange. Then I'd go back to my other duties, but he'd just keep on staring. So on and so on. And all the time, he only ordered one more soda and he didn't talk to anyone else. He had his smartphone on the counter, but I never saw him look at it once. As I said before, I've experienced worse, so I figured that he was probably socially awkward or maybe just lonely. Whatever he was though, he wasn't particularly subtle. By midnight, Vern was the only person still sitting at the bar. There were 2 guys playing pool in the back room and a few guys smoking on the patio, but Vern and I were the only ones in the main room. In that sort of situation, it'd feel rude to not chat up the only person left in the vicinity. It's part of my job to make people feel welcome after all. But despite it being a super slow night, I felt drained and I just couldn't find the energy to strike up a genuine conversation with someone who was making me feel like I was on full display. I figured it would be a good time to go to the storeroom and grab a few cases of beer that I had to restock soon anyway. I excused myself and told Vern that I was going to the office and would be right back, but if he needed anything, he could holler. When I made it inside the office, I immediately felt a sense of relief, like I'd finally made it backstage after a gruelingly long performance. It took me about 30 seconds to grab the stuff I needed, but I decided to sit down and fuck around on my phone for a few minutes, enjoying the peace of my solitude. I stayed there until it felt like I'd been away from my post for a bit too long, at which point I grabbed the beer cases and headed back to the bar. To my surprise, Vern was gone by the time I got back, and there was a $20 bill under his glass. I suddenly felt guilty, not because I just made money off of him, though of course that was appreciated, but because maybe he really was just some horny, closeted dude who didn't know how to interact with other guys. And maybe the money was his only reliable way of expressing gratitude for the company. Maybe I had misread the cues and was projecting my own insecurities onto his admittedly awkward behavior. Maybe. In any case, he was gone now, and I still had more to do. So I placed the cash in my tip jar and mentally thanked him for it. I began going about my tasks for the rest of the shift and quickly put Vern out of my head. An hour or so later, around 1 a.m., I escorted the final stragglers outside and closed the front door. I work alone on Monday nights, so it usually takes me a little less than an hour to finish my tasks after closing. As per usual, I put on some chill music and went on to autopilot. I finished everything about 2 a.m. After turning off the last few lights, I grabbed my knapsack, set the alarm, and headed out the front door, which locks on its own. I started to amble down the street towards my car, which was the only one left on the block. All I could think about was how badly I needed to pack a bowl and jump into the shower. When I reached the back door of my car, I absent-mindedly yanked it open and threw my knapsack into the back seat. Slamming the door closed, I stepped up to the driver's side door and pulled the handle before climbing inside. Only as my ass made contact with the seat and I reached my hand toward the open door did I realize that I hadn't taken my car keys out of my bag. I never actually unlocked my car. A wave rolled over me, like I had jumped into the ocean and I saw something in the periphery of my vision. I kid you not. There he was, just sitting there in my passenger seat. I'm not at all ashamed to admit that I screamed. The driver's side door was still wide open, but I didn't, nor couldn't, move. I just stared at Vern, dumbfounded. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," Vern said. I didn't immediately respond, so he quickly followed up with, "I thought we could hang out, maybe play some games together." Then, like it was fucking nothing, he handed me my car keys, which he had obviously stolen out of my bag during those minutes that I was in the office. He apologized again, presumably for having my keys in the first place. Then he offhandedly gave me an address and said that he didn't live far away, if I was interested. I'd like to say that I was this close to grabbing him by the collar and beating the shit out of him, but something in my gut urged me strongly to play along, to pretend like the situation wasn't completely bonkers. The street was deserted. I had no idea if he was armed, just how unhinged he was, i.e., too many variables to consider. "No worries, man," I said casually, like he was an old childhood friend who'd just flown into town to surprise me on my birthday. "I just wasn't expecting to see you." I had no idea what I should say. It might have been a stupid decision on my part, and there were probably 1,001 things I should have done instead. But I tried to genuinely meet him halfway and just be as gracious as possible, while staying as calm as possible too. "That sounds cool, but it was a crazy long night for me, and I'm really tired. Think we can rain check?" A few silent moments passed, but I suppose I sounded genuine enough, because he crossed his arms and simply said, "Okay." I asked him if he had his car parked nearby, and he said no. I didn't press the issue further, and again, I didn't press the issue any further, and again, a dumb choice on my part. I told him that I'd be happy to drop him off at his place, at which point we could trade numbers and make plans in the morning, after I'd gotten some sleep. Somehow appeasement seemed safer than flat-out confrontation, or running away. I didn't want to offend him or make him feel like he was in the wrong. I had no idea what he was capable of, whether he was actually malevolent or just an alien from another social dimension. He quietly agreed to the ride. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life. On the way, I asked him about how his day went and what games he liked and other random bullshit. I mentioned multiple times that I was really glad to meet another gamer and that it'd be fun to share the hobby with someone else. Basically, I said whatever it took to keep the conversation light and flowing. But he didn't say much at all aside from occasionally directing me left or right. And whatever he did say had sort of a petulant tone to it. I felt like I was driving home a psychotic toddler whom I just refused McDonald's to. He looked out the passenger window the entire ride. Occasionally, I would glance over at him, but mostly I tried to keep my eyes forward, because I found that focusing on the road made me feel more centered. Of course, a part of me wishes now that I had acted more assertively, whipping around a sharp turn and sending him flying effortlessly out the window. You know, something badass. But being friendly and accommodating was really the only thing that seemed appropriate at the time. My grandfather always said, "Kill him with kindness," and I disagree that that's always the correct solution, but it's what I did that night, and it worked out. I considered driving directly to a police station, but I wasn't terribly familiar with the neighborhood, and I didn't want to rile him up by taking out my phone. Before long, we had arrived. The destination itself was a small park in a suburb that I'd only driven through a couple of times previously. He said that he'd walk the rest of the way, and at his request, I brought the car to a stop on the corner. There was a short, albeit somewhat terrifying lull before either of us said anything or made any sort of move. I offered to put my number into his phone, but he refused and simply said thanks before exiting the car. As soon as he closed the door, I hightailed it down the street. I drove aimlessly for about a mile before I pulled over and just idled on the side of the main road. I sat in silence for a few moments, and then called my boss, who, at this point, is a good friend. Honestly, I didn't care that it was after 2 a.m. He picked up after the first couple of rings, and I quickly regurgitated everything that had happened. He was a good sport about it, and didn't just play it off for laughs, instead expressing legitimate concern. We had a mandatory staff meeting that next week in which everyone was told they needed to be on guard and how the bar would be installing several cameras for extra security. Thankfully, I haven't run into Vern again since that night, nor have any of the other bartenders. So Vern, let's not meet ever again, at my bar or anywhere else. I have bear spray now. Also, actual bears. This happened back when I was in the 4th grade. It always stuck out to me as odd, but when I became an adult, it dawned on me just how dangerous it actually was. I had been invited to a friend's birthday party, which was to be held at a popular pizza joint that had a bunch of arcade games and stuff. The pizza place was right next door to a small movie theater, and the movie Titanic had just come out, so there was a decent amount of people in this part of the shopping center. My mom had to run some errands and pick up one of my other brothers, so she dropped me off along the way. She said she was going to stay until others arrived for the party, but I knew she had a lot to do. The place was familiar to me, and I knew my friends were either already inside or would be there shortly. So I implored her to just drop me off, and I went inside. My mom had also arranged a ride home for me from one of my friend's parents. But to my surprise, when I walked in, I learned that no one had gotten there yet. So I had to look around at the different games and then went outside the restaurant to wait for my friends to show up. There were a bunch of people outside the theater, lined up waiting to get inside for the early evening showing of Titanic. That's when I noticed that a couple, guy and a girl, were standing by a car smoking cigarettes and looking over at me. A chunk of time had passed, maybe about 20 minutes, and I was super confused why my friends hadn't shown up yet. I knew for a fact that I was at the right place and that I showed up at the right time. I was going over all the reasons why they might be late when the cigarette-smoking couple came over to me and began talking. They asked me what or who I was waiting for. Obviously, at first, I was hesitant to talk to a couple of strangers, but they looked to be my oldest brother's age, late teens, early 20s, so I had been around older people and wasn't too bashful or shy around them. I explained to them that I was waiting for my friends to show up for a birthday party, but they hadn't shown up yet, and they were all pretty late. The couple made some other small talk, told me that they were waiting to see the movie, but when they showed up, all the tickets had sold out for the showing that they wanted, so they were just going to hang out until the next showing, which they had successfully gotten tickets for. After a little while longer of waiting and talking with this couple, they asked if I was hungry. I said I was, and they offered to buy me a pizza. As a hungry kid who was seriously looking forward to pizza, but unsure if the party was still going to happen, I wasn't about to pass it up. We went inside, ordered, and sat down. I ended up hanging out with this couple for a long time. They were being super nice to me, gave me money for the arcade games, bought me as much pizza and soda as I wanted. I had almost completely forgotten about my friends and the party until I saw what time it was. Almost 2 hours had passed, and I started to get pretty nervous and anxious. I wasn't sure how I was going to get home. I didn't have a cell phone. This was around 1997, and neither did my parents. My mom would be furious that A, no one showed up to the party, B, I didn't seek out help from the restaurant or some kind of security guard or police officer, and C, I spent the last 2 hours with strangers, accepting food and money from them. I decided to ask this couple what I should do, and this is where things started to get really strange. The guy turned to me and said flatly, "You don't need to go home." Thinking back, I definitely couldn't fully comprehend the weight of what he had just said. I didn't know what to say, so I kind of shrugged in confusion and said that I needed to find a phone. I went up to the counter and asked if I could use their phone, and they let me. I called home, but no one answered. I tried again. Still nothing. I then told the people at the counter that I was trying to get picked up, but no one was answering the phone at home. I must have looked pretty panicked, because just then, the guy from the couple came over and put his hand on my shoulder, said, "Don't worry, we'll get this figured out." He then gave me some more money to play a few more arcade games, while he figured it out with the guys behind the counter. No idea what they talked about specifically, but I ended up playing another game and then went back to the table that we were at. The guy from the couple came back over and said they were going to take me home. He was being super positive and upbeat about it, and was insisting that it was no problem whatsoever. His girlfriend was also being very insistent and supportive of the idea. Part of me was a bit hesitant, because I was taught stranger danger and all that. But the other part of me was wanting to believe it was all really innocent, and I was really grateful that these people had been so nice to me, fed me, and kept me entertained. They had even missed their movie to stay with me. I said that I wanted to try calling home a few more times. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I tried calling home a bunch more, but there was still no answer. I decided then that I would say yes to these people and have them take me home. Again, I was young, impressionable, and naive. The people behind the counter must have been seeing this from the more rational side and realized something seriously fishy was going on. One of them had gone on break and called the police to come over and address the situation. Policeman shows up and comes over to figure out what was going on. I don't remember everything about the conversation, but what it ended up coming down to was who was going to take me home. The couple was still really insistent. Thinking about this as an adult, I find it strange that the cop was even considering letting this whole thing be an option. There is no question in my mind that the cop should have shut the conversation down and taken me home himself. But for some odd reason, they let me decide. I felt like I was being pressured. I remember going back and forth in my mind. These people had been so nice to me, had hung out with me, and I didn't want to be rude. And I also felt really intimidated by the police officer. I remember this part as if it were yesterday. As I was thinking, the cop went over to talk to some of the guys behind the counter. And while he was away, the guy from the couple looked at me with a smile and asked, "Do you want to go with him or us?" I told him I would go with them. Again, in hindsight, I still can't believe the cop let this happen. As we were getting our things to go, the officer did say that he was going to follow us the whole way, which was a dose of redemptive assurance. The officer asked for my address and my parents' names. I got in the couple's car and told them where I lived, and we were off on our way. The girl was driving, and the guy was in the front passenger seat. The entire drive, the guy was looking over his shoulder out the back window, glancing back and forth between me and the cop following behind us. We eventually pulled up to my house, and I went up to the front door while both the couple and the cop were parked on the street. Opened the door, went inside, and saw that my mom was looking out the window with a very confused and concerned look on her face. She went outside and found out all that had happened, and she was furious. I didn't ever tell her the specific things that the couple had said to me. Again, I didn't understand the full gravity of the whole situation until years later. Going through this whole scenario in my head, if the cop hadn't followed us, I more than likely would have been abducted. Thinking about all the things that they had done and said, befriending me and feeding me and giving me money to play games, was them totally trying to come across as disarming, trusting, and friendly. A totally fucked up situation that could have been so much worse. Hard to think about. I'm almost 30 now and have kids of my own, and thinking about them in this kind of situation makes my blood boil and my stomach turn. Turns out the reason why my friends never showed up and the party never happened was because they had to cancel it last minute and didn't think to call me to let me know. So there's also that. I work as a leasing agent at an apartment complex. it happens to be a very large building with over 500 residents. So, needless to say, I interact with a lot of people, and sometimes I meet some very interesting characters. One day, it happened to be a slow summer afternoon. This old man walks in, inquiring about our property and asking if he could take a tour. I asked him for his ID before the tour starts. It's law and policy. And he made a joke saying, "What? Do you not trust me?" I let out an awkward laugh, but in my mind's eye, no, I don't trust anybody that I just met. Although after a moment, I chalked it up to him just being a boomer and telling stupid boomer jokes. Didn't think anything more of it. He complied, gave me his ID, and we were off on the tour. The majority of the time strolling the property, he was telling me how much I reminded him of his daughter. He told me all these stories about her growing up. I thought it was cute, and it had an air of an old man reminiscing about the good old days. I tried my best to keep up with the conversation and asked what his daughter was up to now. That's when he trailed off and said, "She has a good life, but it's rather monotonous. I'm not going to bore you with the details of it." We finally reached the end of the tour, and he decides that he'd like to apply. Well, later that day, I ran his screening, and it came back almost instantly as rejected. Now, there can be many reasons why this would happen. 1, he didn't meet the income qualifications. 2, he has a poor credit history or poor rental history. 3, he has a criminal record. It turns out that option number 3 was the winner. He had a criminal record. Being an hourly employee, I don't have access to specifics, but my boss does. I approach her later to discuss the man, saying that I didn't feel like he gave me bad vibes at all, and maybe it was just for a minor offense. But regardless, you can never judge a book by its cover. My boss was intrigued enough, so she was able to pull up the police reports. Turns out, that man was arrested back in the 80s and put on a sex offenders list for essaying his daughter, the one that apparently I remind him of.